Hello, first graders. This is Mrs. Gustafson. I'm so excited to do math again with you today. Today, our math lesson is going to look a little different. We're actually going to be doing a reading activity to start with first. It's to get our brains thinking about the story Hansel and Gretel. How many of you have ever read the story Hansel and Gretel before? Well, today I'm going to be reading a small portion of the story to you, focused on the part where Hansel and Gretel lay stones down along the path so they can find their way home. I want you to really pay attention to this part because this will help us with all of our lessons in the next couple weeks with math as we talk more about Hansel and Gretel and how they lay stones to find their way. All right, ready to read with me? Once upon a time, there lived a woodcutter and his wife. They lived in a small cottage with their two children, Hansel and Gretel. These two children were wise beyond their years. Hansel was smart and Gretel was quick-witted. The two children loved to skip stones at a nearby lake. So already, if you're thinking about our time with language arts, you know the character names are Hansel and Gretel, and you know they live in a cottage near a lake. Hansel and Gretel spent most of their time finding the perfect, flattest skipping stones. Their collection of stones was large, as they spent more time collecting them than actually skipping the rocks. I'm thinking in my head for a minute, we did a lot with rocks earlier in the year when we were geologists, so maybe you're making a connection to us having rock collections. One day, the woodcutter's wife said, "Times are tough, my dear children. We must venture into the forest to help your father with his work," she declared. The children decided to bring their sack of stones with them on their journey. So now we have the first piece of action, the beginning of the story, where they are going to set off through the forest. And so Hansel, Gretel, and their mother walked into the thick wooded forest. It was as eerie as thick fog on a stormy night. The sky was a dark gray, and the trees were black and gloomy. Perhaps you're picturing that scene in your head. Luckily, Hansel had remembered to drop the shimmering stones on the ground every few feet so they could follow them on their return home. They traveled for a while, Hansel occasionally dropping stones until they reached a small clearing. Their mother told Hansel and Gretel to sit on a dead log. "I'm going to go gather the wood. Stay here, and I will be back for you shortly," she said. This would be the middle of the story. They're walking along the woods, and their mom says, "You have to wait here for a while." The children stayed seated reluctantly. It means they weren't very excited about sitting on the log. They waited and waited and waited, but their mother never returned for them. Hansel began to worry for their safety. He cried to Gretel, "What if we are attacked or eaten? What about wolves, bears, cougars, raccoons? Gretel, oh Gretel, what are we going to do?" "I will lead us home," she replied, getting up from the dead log. She took Hansel's hand, and the two followed his trail of stones. Their flat surfaces shimmered in the moonlit night. Hansel and Gretel finally arrived back at home at the break of dawn. However, they were so tired they both immediately fell asleep right in front of their cottage door. They awoke tucked in their own beds. All right, my friends, I want you to think for a minute about this story. Hansel and Gretel, they were two very smart kids, and thinking they might get lost in the woods, they decided to drop stones along the way so they would know what their path was. I want you to keep that message in your head as we continue tomorrow with our math work. We will be talking more about Hansel and Gretel and paths through the forest. Thanks for listening.